Rachel.
Hey, Brittany.
So today we're going to talk about this is one of my favorite things to talk about since the election, and that is how podcasts have changed elections. And I'm going to back it up, and we're going to start with a little history of just how Americans used to even learn about candidates, because I find this very, very fascinating. So, way back in the day, you'd go to rallies, you'd hear somebody speak, and there'd be these, we see political buttons now that have like the little, not safety pin, but kind of, and you pin it to your jacket or something, and it says, vote whoever. Well, back in the day, they would be like actual like metal buttons. In fact, if you ever get a chance to go to the American History Smithsonian, which is my favorite place in DC is actually Mount Vernon, in the area, which is George Washington's house. But my second favorite place is the American History Museum, and they will have all George Washington's campaign buttons, and they're literally like these little tin buttons. It's very cool. But
wow. George Washington?
Yes. I love that place. I'm a big American history dork. I have spent so many hours in there. And my boyfriend laughs at me because once you ask me anything about American history, I just yap for hours and hours and hours and don't let anybody else talk. So I'll do my best not to do
I love
today.
it.
Yeah. But so you had to go to these rallies, or my favorite part of American history were the pamphlets. People would write their opinions on pamphlets. Common Sense was a pamphlet. Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers, those were all these pamphlets where people kind of have arguments back and forth on their beliefs, and they'd spread these pamphlets around, kind of like newspapers, but more like magazines. So
like
you didn't
opinion
have
pieces.
Think pieces. Yeah. So you didn't have TV, you didn't have podcasts, you didn't have any of this stuff, right? So that's what you had to do. And there was a good chance, there was a significant chance you probably never got to hear a president speak. You probably never got to hear their voice because there was no radio. You didn't get to know, No. And travel was so hard. So it wasn't like, was like, oh.
They'd have to travel around and give speeches on stump speeches.
Literally a stump speech. They would stand up on a,
or get up on their soapbox.
I was just going to say that. You might hear that word. It's because there were literal crates that carried soap. And at the empty ones, they'd put it down and they'd stand on their soapbox. So, So now you get some fun origins of those words. So then time progressed and you had the radio, and wow, right? That was a game changer. Suddenly you had people's voices in your homes. Who was it with the fireside chats? That was Roosevelt.
FDR.
Yeah. So was it weekly? I was not. Neither of us were alive in the 40s. So let me just clarify. But.
No, I'm not quite that old.
But they were recurring. I don't remember if it was weekly or what it was, but you have these like fireside chats where he'd do like a radio show. And so you'd hear his voice come over on a radio, and no matter where you were,
right there in your living room,
in your home.
Yeah.
And you'll notice back then people had more of like that like radio speech like voice. That was not what it sounded like at all. I don't know why I did that. That sounded like a baseball announcer. But they had these voices that were almost very theatrical, because when you can't see somebody's face, which we know because the podcast used to just be audio, you are trying to get your point across and you're trying to be dramatic, because we're all a little dramatic, especially politicians. So you had to kind of act it out, right? You had to be very theatrical with your voice. So that was amazing. So suddenly people were learning about their candidates through radio, through newspaper. Obviously, maybe you'd see a picture and you'd read something, and there was no internet or anything. So we pretty much just believed what we were told, right? It was, okay, well, you might have two competing newspapers. That was kind of your only chance for any different thought, right? You'd have like, well, this newspaper said this and that one said this, and then maybe there'd be like an independent newspaper, which is what you'd call like a smaller company. It wasn't like the big ones. It was like a ragtag kind of thrown together organization. So you'd have to read all these things and maybe get to hear their voice on the radio if your family could afford a radio in the house, right? So there was, it wasn't always easy. So then something very interesting happened in, and I didn't have the exact date, but it was the 1960 election, because it was when John F. Kennedy became president. So during that election, they have the presidential debates, which we all, know, we've probably seen them. And it had never been televised before. They had done them through radio. They had done them through other means. And John F. Kennedy was known as being like, he was young. You have to remember, we had all these just old dudes as president, right? Very, very old. Roosevelt, he had polio, but he couldn't walk. So he, not only is he an older man, he can't walk. It seemed, there was
most people didn't know that. Most people didn't know that he was,
because they couldn't see him.
Yeah.
So then you have the 60s, and the 60s were a big time for everything. You had music was changing into rock and roll. You had, desegregation. Finally, people were realizing, like, why are we treating people based on the color of skin? You had the civil rights movement, and you had television. And television was making these candidates seem like real people because you weren't just hearing them on the radio. You weren't just hearing newspapers. You got to see their face. And on the day of the first televised presidential debate, the reason I bring this up, that they were all old. John F. Kennedy was young. I think he was barely 40. I might be right.
Very
at most
telegenic.
45, but very handsome. All the women found him handsome. Very put together. His family was Jackie Kennedy was just known for just being a style icon. He had this adorable, daughter and son. So he was this picture perfect American family. Yes. And then he was handsome and articulate, even though I can't stand the Boston accent. I'm sorry. He had that Boston accent that he had. So then he goes on stage next to Richard Nixon, who's much older, a bit chubbier. And he had the flu that day. So he was sweating and he just looked terrible. And for a while, like, Kennedy was just like, why are we going to vote for this young man? He doesn't know. What does he know about, being president? Until the debate aired and Kennedy looked poised, put together, sounded great. And Nixon is sweating and he looks old and he looks out of shape. And when the people saw that, they were like, oh my goodness, we've got to vote for this Kennedy guy. And that's attributed largely in part, not just that, for why Kennedy was able to win over the American people. And then that became a trend as time went on. And now Ronald Reagan was interesting because he was an actor before he was a president. So he had already kind of been on camera. That wasn't that new. But he went on a late night talk show and that became big. And then, this is actually one of my earliest presidential election memories. I remember Bill Clinton going on Arsenio Hall with his saxophone. Was it saxophone? And it was like, oh my goodness, a president playing us. He's like one of us. And so it made them seem human. It made them seem real. We could see ourselves in them. Now, over time, as we all know, because you're listening to the show, the mainstream media and all these talk shows have become very biased, very leftist centered. And they're not asking hard questions. If you watch any interview with Kamala Harris from this last election, she doesn't seem like a real person. I've watched Muppets and puppets that seem like more interesting, down-to-earth people. It was
pretty sad.
It was sad. It was very like sound bites and answers, and I'm not even going to answer what you asked me. I'm going to answer something else. And so it didn't seem real. I could not relate to her. And then, so a lot of you know I do comedy in my spare time, and so I will listen to a lot of comedian podcasts. And then all of a sudden, towards the end of the election cycle, closer to the election day, this cool thing happened where all these comedians started having Donald Trump on or J.D. Vance on. And I'll be honest, I didn't have any opinion on J.D. Vance. I knew he lived near me. I didn't have any opinion on him. And this is not me saying that this is going to be the best presidency ever. I'm not even saying that. I'm not even saying anything political. I'm just saying, as far as like actually hearing a person talk and being like, that's interesting, I can relate to that. Hearing J.D. Vance on a comedian podcast talking about his upbringing, he grew up very poor, a mother who struggled with addiction. I was so touched by that story and that he seemed like a real person. He was cracking jokes. And people, the mainstream media is making fun of podcasts like, oh, you're going to get your news from a podcast. And it's like, yeah, but millions and millions of people are now choosing to listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Not your interview show, because people feel like they can let their guard down. A Kamala Harris interview is maybe 40 minutes max. When J.D. Vance was on Joe Rogan, he was on there for 3 hours. And
which is typical.
Which is typical. And you can get into your life and talk about that. That even, Trump's really easy to laugh at because he says pretty silly things. But when I saw him
he laughs at himself.
He laughs at himself.
He doesn't take himself too seriously.
But when I heard him on the Theo Von podcast, he seemed actually like a very serious guy, just talking about his kids. And the Andrew Schultz podcast, another comedian, he was just talking about his kids, talking about being a dad. And I was like, wow, this is making, even if you don't want to vote for him, if you don't agree with them, that's not the point of this conversation, but it made them seem like one of us. It made me put my guard down and be like, You know, that story is relatable, especially JD Vance, because I was like, wow, like he grew up from nothing. I did not know he was my age, around my age, which was really crazy because I'm like, I'm not old enough to be running for president. I'm like, oh, well, I guess I am getting old enough. But it was really, it really brought these people, just like the radio brought presidents into the home for the first time.
Yeah.
It really brought these candidates into my life. And, you know, RFK, actually JFK's nephew, same thing, watching him on podcasts, because he had an injury, and so his voice is not always the easiest to listen to. And so I don't know that if I was just listening to him on a radio, I would have really been able to understand some of the stuff he said, and then seeing him on podcasts. So it was interesting to see. I personally believe that those podcast appearances really helped tip the election, and it may have the same outcome regardless, but it really humanized these people in a way that the mainstream media doesn't know they don't know how to do it anymore. And what's really interesting is Kamala Harris, they were talking to Rogan about going on the show. Yes. And they said, only if you come to me. Now, one of the things about Joe Rogan's podcast is in his studio, everybody knows too what the setup is. And they said, and you only get 40 minutes, because they knew that she couldn't sit there for 3 hours and talk, because you have to let your guard down. You have to be a real person or a Muppet.
Yep, that's a problem.
Like I said, Muppets are better. I love the Muppets. Side note, Britney trivia. I absolutely adore the Muppets. But
oh, cool. Me too.
But they're great. But so that I personally believe that podcasts really, this election particularly, and they've been around for longer, really showed us that we don't have to rely on these old ways anymore, the legacy media, as they call it. And again, that's not new. Podcasts have been around forever. Everybody and their mom has a podcast, right?
These days. Yeah. This is such a good point that you bring up. It is really another revolution in political communication, just like the advent of radio and television, and even print way back when.
Yeah.
But what concerns me, my big fear, is the Trump election, the landslide. Has really brought a lot of attention to podcasts, and there's endless comparisons to the audience size in the mainstream media versus now podcast size. You know, like I heard a statistic that Anderson Cooper on what is he on? Is he CNN these days?
Is he?
Anyway, he's a major personality on evening cable news, and he's only getting like 80,000, like less than 100,000 listeners in the key demographic that they talk about. And that's like the 18 to 45-year-olds or whatever. Yeah, it's what the advertisers want. They want to reach those people to tell them about their tell them about their products.
Or sponsored by Pfizer vaccines.
Yeah, that's who supports the mainstream media. But with podcasting being this wild west where anyone can start one, and they can also be very profitable because they can garner a huge audience, like many multiples more than like the highly controlled and regulated and scripted Anderson Cooper, you know, like all of these shows. It's getting the attention of like the mainstream media and the big corporations behind that. And maybe things are shifting to introduce more control into podcasting. That's my fear, is we're getting attention, and sometimes it can be attention that you don't want.
You know, and we've got to wrap up a minute, but I want to say I am more optimistic in this area, and I think it is because when they tried to cancel Joe Rogan when he got on Spotify, Spotify essentially looked at how many people are listening to Joe Rogan, which is he's the highest listened to podcast in the world. And it comes back to the market competition and that money can be a good incentivizer or incentive. Yeah. I'm just making up words now. Because he was too popular. Sure, they could kick him off Spotify and maybe they'd be a woke hero for a couple weeks. but they're not going to
But
miss
they'd be
out on all
losing
the money. And so
Yeah, they're losing so much money. So the free market wins in
the
that
free
case.
market wins. So I think as long as they keep doing what they're doing well, you know, and they don't have to sell off their lemonade stand like we talked about in an earlier episode,
Yeah.
I think we'll be fine. But yeah, it's been fascinating. It's something I love watching, these new trends, these new disruptors and the way things were. That's been a real hobby of mine for a long time. So I'm really excited to talk about this and to see what happens with podcasts in the future. So thanks for
stay
listening.
tuned.
Please don't
Yeah,
forget
thanks
to
for
like
joining
and
us.
subscribe to the podcast. Until next time, Rachel, we'll talk to you later.
See you later.